Hi everybody, the purpose of this training video is to give you guys an introduction into Applied Behavior Analysis, or ABA, as well as just to give you guys some general information about our field. And before we get started, I want you guys to look at the picture, and the saying says, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. So I want you guys to think about this saying with regards to ABA, and I'm going to be asking you guys more about the saying sometime in the future. All right, so for our agenda, we are going to talk about the history of ABA. We're going to talk about the 4 branches of ABA. We're going to talk about the 7 dimensions of ABA. We're going to talk about how ABA works, and then some basic foundational principles of ABA. And then we're going to do a summary and wrap up the lecture. So here are our objectives for this lecture. I want you guys to, by the end of it, understand the definition of applied behavior analysis, understand the history of it, be able to tell me how the terms behavior modification and applied behavior analysis are different. I want you guys to know and identify the 7 dimensions. We're going to talk about them today, and then you guys were also supposed to read the article on the 7 dimensions before you watch the lecture. I want you guys to be able to describe what the function of behavior is, so what we mean by that, and its importance to applied behavior analysis. And then I want you guys to be able to understand and identify some basic foundational principles, and then identify at least 3 important leaders in the field of ABA. So let's talk about some history. Every time I bring up this slide, I feel like students just kind of roll their eyes and just expect it to be boring. I love the history of our field, so hopefully it won't be too bad for you guys. So behavior analysis actually got its start in psychology. And way back in the day, it kind of started with Pavlov. And Pavlov actually wasn't a psychologist, he was a Russian physiologist, and he was studying the digestive systems of dogs. And he actually won a Nobel Prize in 1904 for his work. And what he would do, as you guys can see here in this picture with a dog, he would attach a salivation tube to the dog's mouth, and then whenever the dog would salivate, he would be able to catch it in the tube and be able to measure it. And so what he was kind of doing was putting food in the dog's mouth, or I think he was actually more technically putting like a little bit of an acid solution on the dog's mouth, and then the dog would produce saliva. And what he found was when the dog would hear the experimenters walk in the room, so just hear the footsteps, the dog would automatically start salivating. So the food didn't even have to be in the dog's mouth. It could just, the dog essentially associated the footsteps with the food and would then salivate to the footsteps. So this became the basis for Pavlov's respondent conditioning paradigm. And I do want to point out that depending upon which perspective you take, you're going to call this something different. So if you research this type of conditioning, you'll typically call it classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning. However, if you're a behavior analyst, you're going to call it respondent conditioning. And I do want to talk about this a little bit more when we get to, after I've kind of explained respondent and operant conditioning. So with respondent conditioning, essentially you have an unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, and it's going to elicit an unconditioned response, which is the salivation to the food. Now, when we say unconditioned, that means that this is unlearned. So this is due to our evolutionary history of a species. You put food in our mouth, we're going to salivate. It's something that we're born with. Now, we take the food, that unconditioned stimulus, and we pair it with something neutral. So in Pavlov's experiments, he oftentimes used a bell or a tone and things like that. And originally, the bell is neutral. So you ring the bell and the dog doesn't salivate at all. But then you start pairing the bell with the food. So he rings the bell, he gives the dog food. He rings the bell, he gives the dog food. And eventually, after you've paired the bell and the food, then the bell by itself is going to elicit salvation. And when that happens, the bell is now called the conditioned stimulus, and the salvation to the bell is called the conditioned response. So when you see the word condition, that means some type of learning has occurred. So those are kind of your 4 terms with respondent conditioning. You have unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, and remember, those are due to our evolutionary learning history, and we don't have to be taught them. You put food in our mouth, we're going to salivate. And then you have a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response, and those 2 things have to be learned. So you're going to pair, so the conditioned stimulus is originally neutral. You pair it with the unconditioned stimulus, and then after pairing, it becomes a conditioned stimulus that elicits the conditioned response. With respondent conditioning, behaviors are reflexive and involuntary. So they involve our autonomic nervous system. So like I said, these are reflexive behaviors, they're involuntary. And because of that, you guys are going to hear the term elicit. So you probably heard me saying it whenever I was explaining respondent conditioning. So an unconditioned stimulus is going to elicit an unconditioned response. That means it's a reflex, it's involuntary. You give the dog food, he's going to salivate. After conditioning, you present the bell and you're going to get salvation. It's a reflex, it's an involuntary response. So you guys can use that on your quizzes or on the RBT exam, anything like that. When you see the word elicit, we're talking about respondent conditioning. All right, so there are so many applications of respondent conditioning. A lot of behavior analysts don't really take the time to understand respondent conditioning and don't really see how it's applicable in what we do. But I think it's really applicable, and I think it's worth taking the time to actually understand respondent conditioning and how we actually apply it. So we are going to be talking about respondent conditioning as we go through the course. So some applications of respondent conditioning. Do you guys ever get nervous or scared when you go to the dentist? I know I do. I don't want to go to the dentist at all. I hate being in the waiting room. I hate sitting in the chair, everything like that. I just get super nervous and I just don't want to be there. So we can actually explain this through respondent conditioning. So first, let's identify the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. Okay, so I'm gonna help you out. I'm gonna help you guys out with this one, and then I'm gonna ask you guys to kind of do some on your own. So first of all, think about when you see the dentist chair. Originally, the chair should be neutral and shouldn't elicit any type of fear or anxiety. So what does? First of all, we have the tools, which elicit pain. So the tools, when the dentist sticks those tools in your mouth, they typically hurt. So, and having that tool press down on your teeth and do those things and elicit pain is unconditioned. So that's due to our evolutionary history. So now we take the dentist chair. So you're sitting in the chair before the tools go in your mouth. So now you're going to pair the dentist chair with the tools. And after a couple of pairings, just seeing the dentist chair is going to elicit fear and anxiety. Now, I want to point out that your unconditioned response and your conditioned response are not always the same. So a lot of times you're going to see examples of respondent conditioning, and they are going to be, well, they're never the same because they're 2 different responses, but they're going to be very similar. In this example, the tools actually elicit pain, but the dentist chair isn't actually doing anything to your mouth. So it is not possible to elicit pain, but it will elicit fear and anxiety because the tools have elicited pain in the past. So let's do another scenario. Susie goes outside to play in her treehouse. A swarm of bees nested near her treehouse. A swarm of bees is nested near her treehouse, and she gets stung when she climbs up to the treehouse. This happens 3 times in a week. Susie becomes afraid to go near the tree and cries violently when her dad tries to get her to climb up to the treehouse. So let's do this one together. let's pick out the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. So first of all, we have the treehouse, and the treehouse is originally neutral. So she was fine going up it, and then after this scenario, she sees the treehouse and she has fear, so she gets scared. So treehouse was originally neutral. Okay, so let's think about our unconditioned stimulus. This is something that's going to elicit a response due to our evolutionary history. And remember, little Susie, little Susie got stung. So we have a bee sting, which elicits pain. Now, we have that neutral stimulus, which is our treehouse, and our treehouse gets paired with the bee sting, which elicits the pain. So after a couple of pairings, I think it was 3 times, she saw the treehouse, get stung, has pain, sees the sees the treehouse, gets stung, that elicits pain. Now the treehouse, just seeing it, is going to elicit that fear and that crying. Okay, here's another example. I want you guys to pause this video and try to do this on your own. So try to pick out your unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. So Jerry's wife, Mary, gets a new nightgown and wears it whenever she's in the mood for sexual relations. After a month, the sight of the nightgown alone is enough to excite Jerry. So whenever you do this, we have the nightgown, which is our neutral stimulus, and before the sexual relations with the nightgown was neutral, so it did not elicit any type of sexual arousal. So in this example, your unconditioned stimulus is probably going to be the sexual relations, which elicit sexual arousal. The neutral stimulus, which was your nightgown, gets paired with the sexual relations, which elicit that sexual arousal. And after a couple of pairings of wearing the same nightgown and engaging in sexual relations, the nightgown now elicits sexual arousal. And this is an example where you see that unconditioned response and the conditioned response look very, very similar. All right, so that is classical conditioning, respondent conditioning. I was actually in grad school trained by a guy who did research on Pavlovian conditioning. So my training, I'm used to calling it classical or Pavlovian conditioning, but I have to be careful when I'm around behavior analysts and make sure I call it respondent conditioning. All right, so after Pavlov, within the field of psychology, the psychologists at this time studied the mind. So that was their topic of study. And they were interested in how the mind works and things like that. And to measure the mind, because we can't see it and observe it, they would use what we call introspection. So essentially they would, take a red Solo cup and put it in front of you, and they would ask you, tell me everything about this cup. So what do you see? How does it make you feel? Things like that. And introspection is, as you guys can probably guess, not very valid and not very reliable at all. So around 1913, around the 1920s, John Watson came up and said, we should not be studying the mind because we can't see it and we can't measure it. And we're trying to measure it through introspection, and it's not very valid or reliable. So he suggested that psychology should change their focus from the mind to behavior. And we can see behavior, we can measure behavior, and we should approach studying behavior just like the natural sciences do. So just like biology studies their topics and things like that. So we should be using the scientific method just like the natural sciences do, because now we have something that we can see and we can measure. Watson actually took Pavlov's paradigm of respondent conditioning and applied it to emotional behavior in humans. And he kind of classified what we call SR psychology. So something happens in the environment that elicits a response. So we call this SR, or stimulus response psychology. So Watson's most famous study was with a little kid named Little Albert. And you guys can see an actual picture of him on the bottom right. But Little Albert, in general, he was, I think he was a 9-month-old little baby. Watson taught at a college where there was an orphanage attached to it. So he got Little Albert, and Little Albert really wasn't afraid of anything. They put a lot of things in front of him. They put a white rat, they put a bunny, they put a monkey, things like that. And he was just really happy baby. Those things didn't bother him at all. So what they did was, since the white rat was neutral, it didn't bother him, they took a white rat, and every time Little Albert would reach for the white rat, they would bang this pipe behind him. And the banging, of course, scared him, so he would cry. And they only had to do this about 7 times. So they presented the white rat, he would reach for the white rat, they would do a bang. So essentially they were pairing the white rat with the bang. And you guys can think of our respondent conditioning paradigm, or the classical conditioning paradigm. Little Albert sees the white rat, automatically starts crying. So your unconditioned stimulus is the bang, which elicits the crying. It's unconditioned, so due to our evolutionary history. And the white rat was originally neutral. The white rat gets paired with the bang, and then the white rat becomes a conditioned stimulus that in itself elicits the crying, or the conditioned response. This study is controversial, right? If somebody tried to do this today, it probably wouldn't get past the IRB. The IRB is our ethics board that we have to pass all our studies through to make sure that they're ethical. But it was monumental for science, and that at this time, emotional behavior was thought to be something in our unconscious that's seeping up, or due to some traumatic childhood experience. So Freud's views on emotional behavior and his perspective had really shaped emotional behavior to this time. And Watson just essentially shows that, hey, it's a learned behavior. So with Watson, like I stated before, he termed what we'd had SR psychology, so stimulus response psychology. You know, you see, I don't know, a white rat elicits the crying, so stimulus and then a response. Skinner then came about around the 1935, 1940, and Skinner just wasn't satisfied with there only being something before the behavior and the behavior. So Skinner really started looking at what was happening after the behavior and the consequence of the behavior. And Skinner came up with what he called operant conditioning. And this is learning controlled by the consequences of an organism's behavior. So if you engage in a behavior and you get a positive consequence, then the future probability of behavior is going to increase. If you engage in a behavior and you get an aversive stimulus, then the future probability of the behavior is going to decrease. And Skinner mostly worked with animals, so he worked with rats and pigeons, and he taught them how to play ping pong. He taught them tons of different things. And operant conditioning is huge in the learning field. Any type of your animal training is due to operant conditioning and things like that. In 1938, Skinner wrote his book, The Behavior of Organisms, where he laid out his principles of operant conditioning, and he called it the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, or EAB. And I point this out because you guys are going to see this later when we talk about the 4 branches of ABA, because one of the branches is EAB, the Experimental Analysis of Behavior. And this is kind of where people are doing more experimental research. So they're testing out theories, they're doing research with animals, and things like that. All right, so with operant conditioning, you're going to have an increase or a decrease of a behavior as a result of its consequences. So you have a rat in a Skinner box. They press the food, they get a food pellet. So for the future effect, the likelihood of the lever pressing is going to increase. Whereas if you had a rat and they pressed the lever and they got a mild shock, then the future effect, the likelihood of the lever pressing would decrease. So Skinner added that last part after the response. And Skinner's psychology was referred to as SRS psychology, so stimulus response stimulus psychology. So remember, Watson just had SR, and Skinner now has added that third component, SRS. Now with operant conditioning, the behaviors are goal-directed and voluntary, which is different from your respondent conditioning. And now we say that an organism emits a behavior. So something in the environment, so a stimulus in the environment before the behavior occurs. And respondent conditioning, that behavior that's going to happen is the stimulus is going to elicit that behavior. It's going to be a reflex. But with operant conditioning, whatever is before the behavior, whatever is occurring in the environment before the behavior, that's going to set the occasion for the behavior to occur. But the behavior is still voluntary. So we say that the animal emits behavior. It's not a reflex or anything like that. The behavior is voluntary. Okay, so we talked about respondent conditioning, we talked about operant. So I want to just kind of summarize these two and make sure that you guys know the difference between them. So with respondent, the response is elicited. So it's a reflex. It involves our automatic nervous system. With operant, the response is emitted. So it's voluntary or skeletal. And with respondent, we're talking about the association between a CS and a US. Remember, the CS is originally neutral. It gets paired with the US, and after that pairing becomes a conditioned stimulus or a CS. Operant, we're looking at the association between behavior and the consequences. So the organism emits a behavior and some type of consequence is provided by the environment. Now, I want to go back to the term classical conditioning or respondent conditioning. So as a behavior analyst, or in our field of behavior analysis, we're always looking at behavior. So Skinner called classical conditioning respondent conditioning because we are responding to the environment. And he called it operant conditioning because the organism is actually voluntarily operating on the environment. So it's all about behavior and how we're responding to the environment. Respondent conditioning, since our response is elicited, we're responding to the environment. Or operant, we're actually changing the environment with our behavior because we're emitting a behavior. All right, so all of this happened so Watson came about 1913. Skinner was about 1935, 1940. So behaviorism at this time in psychology was huge, all the way up until probably about the 1970s. So if you went to grad school for psychology around 1950, you were a behaviorist, you were working with animals, you were in the lab, all that good stuff. But people weren't really satisfied with the behaviorist perspective because behaviorists talk about what goes on in the environment and what goes on. We talk about behavior and what goes on in the environment. And people thought that we were missing that kind of mental component about behavior. So around the 1970s, we had the cognitive revolution. And the cognitive revolution came in and behaviorism, the popularity of behaviorism went way down, and the popularity of cognitive psychology went way up. And cognitive psychology, the interest in it stayed way up, and it's still very prominent in psychology today. Actually, the majority of your psychologists are cognitive psychologists. Like I said, the field of behaviorism kind of diminished, but with the new work of ABA, it's starting to get increasingly more popular. I wanted to point this out because there's a difference between a behavioral perspective and a cognitive perspective. And so I want to direct your attention to right down here on this picture with the behavioral theories. So if you take the behavioral perspective, the cause of behavior is in the environment. So you're looking at a relationship between behavior and environment. So you're going to arrange environmental conditions to enhance stimuli. You're going to focus on the design of the environment to optimize learning, and you're going to use reinforcement to increase a behavior. So if you want to change a behavior, or if you want to figure out why a behavior is occurring, you're going to look to the environment because the cause of the behavior is in the environment. With cognitive psychology, they focus on the mental activities of the learner, and they focus on all the cognitive aspects, so decision making, problem solving, things like that. And their viewpoint is that the cognitive thinking causes behavior, which is a very different perspective than the behavioral perspective. So I just want you guys to kind of keep that in mind. And I want you guys to, since you're in this field and you're thinking about becoming RBTs, I want you guys to really think about the cause of our behavior being in the environment. So I know you guys have talked to your friends and have wondered why your friend is doing a specific, what they're doing, like why they're working out all the time or why they're crying all the time or things like that. So you're trying to figure out the why of behavior. And a lot of times we resort to the cognitive aspect. So you're trying to figure out, and we do it, we're human, it's very prominent in our society. You try to figure out what the person is thinking and things like that as to why they're engaging in this behavior. But I want you guys to start thinking about what is happening in the environment, because as a behaviorist, you're going to take the perspective that something in the environment caused the behavior. And it's actually kind of interesting. Every time I start thinking about this, I do the same thing. I think about why my friend's upset or why they did this, and I think about what they must be feeling and what they must be thinking, and why they engage in that behavior. And I always, after all that cognitive thinking, I always come back to something happening in their life, so something in the environment causing their behavior. And so just kind of, I want you guys to sit down and think about that. When you're trying to figure out why people are doing things, look in the environment, look at what's happening in the environment in their life, as opposed to trying to figure out what they're thinking about. With mentalism, or with the cognitive theories, Skinner had a huge problem with this, and the reasons were because a lot of times, like I said, with a cognitive psychologist, the cause of behavior is due to a mental process. And Skinner called these hypothetical constructs because you can't see them, you can't measure them. You can measure them indirectly, but you can't directly measure them, you can't directly see them, so you don't actually know what they are. And this applies to lots of things with that cognitive psychologists talk about. So they talk about decision making, problem solving. They talk about an executive function in the brain. They talk about a visual spatial sketch pad, things like that. And all those things are just hypothetical. We can't see them, we can't measure them. And so there are some problems with explaining why behavior occurs, having the explanation of behavior be due to something that we can't see and we can't measure. And one reason why that's a problem is because it results in explanatory fictions. So if you're trying to explain behavior with something that you can't see and measure and you can't even explain, then that doesn't make a lot of sense. Also, it results in circular reasoning. So a lot of times we'll say something like, why is this kid tantruming? And the person will say, he's tantruming because he has autism. And you'll say, okay, how do you know he has autism? And they'll say, because he's tantruming. And you say, okay, why is he tantruming? Because he has autism. And you get into this circular reasoning, and you're not actually explaining why the behavior is occurring. So those are kind of the problems that Skinner had with mentalism and having the cause of behavior due to some internal process. some cognitive thinking. Okay, so we talked about Skinner and his work, and like I mentioned before, Skinner did a lot of his work with animals, well, mostly all of his work with animals, rats and pigeons, and he would put them in a Skinner box, and all of his research was just really, really highly controlled. If you're working with animals, say rats, a lot of times you can breed them in the lab, so you control every aspect of their life, their learning histories. In the actual research session, there are no outside variables. You can control everything. So he got really reliable and valid data. And that's all fine and good. But we want to know, can all this data actually be applied to humans? Humans are different. You don't breed humans in a lab. We all have our own learning history, which is typically really, really complex. So we come to the research sessions with just, I said, these complex learning histories, and all these variables can influence our research. So can we actually take these animal studies that are really controlled in a laboratory, and can these principles that Skinner found be applied to humans? And the answer is yes. So the first reported study using behavior analytic principles to change human behavior was done in 1959 by Allion and Michael. And basically, they took personnel in a state hospital and they trained those personnel to use techniques that were derived from behavior analysis. And they wanted to use this to improve functioning of residents with schizophrenia and psychiatric diagnoses. And they were able to do that. And they state that they conducted this research as an attempt to discover and manipulate some of the environmental variables for the purpose of modifying behavior. After the study, some of the other kind of monumental ways that the field has developed and the people that have developed them is, so let's see, go back. This was 1959. So in 1965, Lovis and his colleagues conducted the first study to manipulate environmental variables. So basically, they were looking at, they tested, or they worked with a child with schizophrenia, and he was engaging in self-interest behavior, which we call SIB. So you guys will see SIB on the slide. That's self-interest behavior. And basically, they provided social attention systematically, and they found that his behavior was contingent on the social attention. So whenever they provided social attention, the behavior increased, and when they didn't provide social attention, the behavior decreased. So first monumental study to manipulate environmental variables with regards to self-interest behavior. And a lot of the early studies focused on self-interest behavior, those really severe problem behaviors. Lovis also developed, Lovis was out in California and developed kind of a whole training manual around ABA, and he was kind of monumental with kind of the first one that started what we call discrete trial training. So we will actually have a training module on this. We call it DTT. Basically, you sit down with the child one-on-one and you present an instruction, they engage in the behavior, and then you provide a consequence. And that would be one trial. And these are discrete trials because there's a start and a stop to the trial. And so basically, you sit one-on-one with the kid and you just run through trials of programs, and we call that discrete trial training. Next, in 1968, we have the Baer, and Risley article, and like I said, you guys should have read this, and we will talk about the 7 dimensions in a little bit, but the 7 dimensions established applied behavior analysis as a field. So our main journal where we publish research is called the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, and the first edition, or the first journal was published in 1968, and the first article was the 7 dimensions of ABA. So laying out our field, what we want to accomplish in the field, and kind of the basis of the field. Next, in 1977, we have Carr. Carr is actually one of the leading, most prominent people in our field, even today. He is actually the head of, oh, sorry, no, actually that's wrong. Anyways, his study in 1977 was the first to promote a system to develop a hypothesis about the function of behavior and then develop a treatment plan based on that function. So he basically, like I said, what you guys need to remember is that he also looked at SIB. Like I said earlier, most of the earlier studies were about self-interest behavior. And like I said, he was the first one to promote a system to develop a hypothesis. And he came up with kind of 3 categories of why a behavior would occur. So when we say the function of behavior, we're talking about why the behavior is occurring. What's the function of it? And he found with his participants that he looked at the consequences and he grouped them into 3 main categories. He grouped them into positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and then what we call automatic reinforcement, or some people call it sensory, where the behavior within itself is reinforcing. And so he looked at these 3 kind of categories. He developed a hypothesis about the function based on those categories. So he would hypothesize that the function of the behavior was positive reinforcement. And then he would develop his treatment plan based on that function. And this is really important to our field because even now, ABA, you find the function of behavior and you design the intervention based on that function. That gives you the most success with your intervention and ensures as well as possible that your intervention will be effective. After Carr, we have Brian Iwata, and he published an article in 1982, which was huge. This is kind of our seminal article on what we call functional analysis. And so basically, he did a study with 9 children who had developmental disabilities and also self-interest behavior, or SIB. And he basically laid out a system about how you can systematically test to determine the function of a behavior. So with Carr, he just promoted a system to develop a hypothesis about the function of behavior. Iwata actually came up with a way to formally and systematically manipulate the environment so that we could actually really determine the function of behavior. And he came up with, I'm actually noticing this. Sorry, oh yeah. I have a typo here. I'm sorry, guys. I'll fix that. It's bugging me. He found, so Carr had 3 categories of functions, and Iwata actually also had 3. He called them attention, escape, and automatic reinforcement. All right, so those are some leading people in our field. In addition to these leading people coming up through the field and kind of changing and evolving our field also had some changes with regards to the name. So you guys might hear behavior modification, and then you also might hear applied behavior analysis. So either behavior modification or behavior analysis. And back in the day, ABA was actually called behavior modification, but the more current term now is behavior analysis. But some researchers still do use these terms interchangeably. But I would urge you guys to kind of push yourselves to use behavior analysis as opposed to behavior modification, because in general, behavior modification for ABA principles is kind of an outdated term. So like I said, everything way back in the day, behavior modification was essentially used with regards to any type of treatment or procedure that changed behavior. It didn't have to be based on behavioral principles. So this might be psychoanalysis or electroshock therapy or things like that. And a lot of times it was referred to changing behavior in residential facilities or hospitals or yeah, hospitals where people had psychiatric disorders and things like that. So it has a lot of negative side effects. Not negative side effects. When people hear the word behavior modification, it has some like a negative tone to it, essentially. And that there are a lot of procedures that they use with people in mental hospitals and things like that that weren't so humane. And so behavior analysis really focuses on changing behaviors using behavioral principles. It really considers the function of the behavior, not just changing behavior in general. We're looking for the function of behavior so that way we can change it, and we attempt to find replacement behaviors as well. So it's just a little bit of a different term. All right, guys, so let's talk about kind of the 4 branches of behavior analysis. And basically our field, like I said, is divided into 4 different sections. We have behaviorism, EAB, ABA, and then the practice of ABA. So let's start with behaviorism. Behaviorism is the theory and the philosophy of our field. So it's this conceptual analysis, theoretical accounts, things like that. When we talked earlier about the difference between behaviorism and cognitive psychology, and that the cause of behavior is in the environment for behaviorists, whereas the cause of behavior is with regards to mental processing with cognitive psychologists. So all those kind of theoretical concepts, that conceptual analysis, is all behaviorism. EAB is what Skinner established in his book in 1938. I told you guys would see that again. EAB is experimental analysis of behavior, and this is your basic research. So your research on basic experimental research on theories. You're typically, it involves research in a laboratory with animals, but you can also do basic research with humans as well. And then ABA is all those behavioral principles that you got in the basic research, but you're applying it to humans to increase a socially significant behavior. So this is the applied side of it. And then you have the practice, where people are using ABA principles, but they're not really certified in ABA. So this would be something like, teachers that don't have a certification but are using some behavioral principles, or animal trainers who aren't certified in ABA, but they're using operant conditioning to train animals. And since we talked about the 4 branches, I'm pretty visual, so I like to think of a tree, and the roots are experimental analysis of behavior. Skinner established that first, and the kind of technical definition of EAB is a science in which procedures derived from the principles of learning are systematically used to change behavior. So you're going to change behavior by systematically using the principles of learning, which are, reinforcement, punishment, stimulus control, discrimination training, extinction, things like that. So just behavior change in general, using systematically using the behavioral principles is what we refer to with EAB. Then remember, behaviorism, that's the philosophy of it. And we're not going to get into the different philosophies. If you guys are really interested in it, Skinner came up with what he called radical behaviorism. Watson took the perspective. He was referred to as a methodological behaviorist. So those different perspectives on the conceptual side of behaviorism is what we mean with the philosophy of it. Then you have applied behavior analysis. And so basically, you're going to take this definition, and the difference is that it's not just used to change behavior, it's used to change socially significant behaviors, and that's where the applied comes in. So you still have the behavior analysis in here, but it's not just any behavior. You're using principles of learning, you're systematically using principles of learning to change a socially significant behavior. And then the last one is that practice guided by behavior analysis. So this course, as we're going through, focuses on the applied side. So using the principles of behavior to systematically improve socially significant behavior. So this is the formal definition of ABA. Applied behavior analysis is a science in which procedures derived from the principles of behavior are systematically applied to improve socially significant behavior. And once again, we talk about socially significant behavior. We're talking about we're going to change a behavior that's going to really be meaningful and really impact somebody's life. So we're going to teach them how to get dressed or brush their teeth, or vocalize or ask for what they want. All those things are socially significant behaviors that really improve and impact somebody's life. Okay, so let's look at our 7 dimensions of behavior by Baer, and Risley. So our 7 dimensions are applied, analytic, behavioral, affective, general, technological, and conceptually systematic. And I want to give you guys an acronym. This is how I remember them. I remember them as get a cab. So if you guys can remember a taxi cab, I know we still have taxi cabs in Houston. I know you guys all use Uber, or what's the other one? Lyft, I think. But think of a taxi cab and think of get a cab, and that'll be your acronym for you guys to remember the 7 dimensions. So let's kind of go through each one of these. So the G in get a cab, first off, refers to general. And you guys can think of generalization because that's really what it's referring to. So it's referring to the behavior change proves durable over time, appears in a wide variety of environments, or spreads to a wide variety of related behaviors. So basically, if you teach a skill, will that skill be emitted in an environment where it was not directly taught? I know that's another typo. I apologize, guys. So will a skill be emitted in an environment where it was not directly taught? So for example, if you teach a kid in the clinic to brush their teeth, are they going to be able to brush their teeth with their parents? Are they going to be able to brush their teeth at home? So are they going to be able to brush their teeth at a friend's house? Is it going to be durable over time? Are they going to be able to continue that behavior? Does it appear in a wide variety of environments? Like I said, can they do it at home? Can they do it in their friend's house? And also you'll get some what we call collateral behaviors as well. So when you teach a kid to brush his teeth, then indirectly he's probably going to have better breath, and in turn might be able to better make friends. So all those things are kind of impact related behaviors of the skill. What you don't want to happen is you don't want to teach a kid a skill and then not have it transfer into the natural environment. So your behavior that you're teaching needs to generalize to other environments, other people, other situations, things like that. Okay, the next letter is E. So we're going to talk about effective. And this means the practical application should change the behavior it seeks to change. So you are always going to be graphing data in ABA. And we are going to talk about how to graph data and how to measure it and things like that. But you're going to look at your data. Is your intervention being effective? Is the data going in the right direction? If you want to increase a behavior, is it increasing? If you want to decrease a behavior, such as smoking, is it decreasing? All those things is your intervention actually being effective? The next one is T, so that's technological. So this is when the procedures are completely and precisely identified and described. So whenever and this can be from lots of different things, you're going to pick a target behavior. Did you completely and precisely identify the target behavior? Your treatment plan, did you lay it out? Is it completely and precisely identified and described how you're going to run your treatment plan? And what you want to think about is, can it be replicated? So think about a recipe. You have people who cook that don't ever write things down. They just throw things in a pan and it comes out perfect. I'm a horrible cook, so if I don't have a recipe that lays everything out that I can replicate it, then my stuff usually doesn't turn out. So think about being able to replicate a recipe. You want somebody, if you implement a treatment that's effective, you need it all to be laid out so that somebody else can also implement the treatment with a different client and it also be effective. Okay, so now we're on A. So we've done get. So we have our first A, which is applied. So this is that applied aspect of applied behavior analysis. So you're going to focus on behaviors that are significant to the participant and those who are close to the participant. So behaviors that are meaningful to the person. And this is a big deal because it is hard to choose what behavior to change. Do you change? One aspect is the severity of the behavior. Do you change if a kid is engaging in self-interest behavior, so maybe scratching his eyes and also writing on the desk? Which behavior do you change? Do you change the more severe one? There might be a behavior that just impacts that person or a behavior that impacts multiple people. So you need to focus on behaviors that are significant to the participant and those that are close to the participant. Okay, start on CAP. So C means conceptually systematic. So your description of procedures, whatever you use, needs to be explained in the basic principles of behavior. So you guys need to make sure that you're conceptually systematic with our field. So you need to talk about the cause of behavior being in the environment, and we talk about reinforcement and punishment, stimulus control and extinction, and all these behavioral principles. And those are the things that you need to talk about to explain the behavior and explain what you're doing. If you start talking about executive function and cognitive things, then that's not being conceptually systematic with our field. And that's when really knowing the difference between, the cognitive side of it and the behavioral side of it, those different perspectives, the behaviorist and the cognitive perspective really come into play. All right, guys, so now we're on to the second A, which is analytic. And this is, did you actually identify a functional relationship between behavior and the environment? So when we talk about functional relationships, I think I've mentioned this before, but I'm not sure. A functional relationship is, if this behavior occurs, then this happens in the environment. And did you actually identify that? So did you actually identify the function of the behavior? When we talk about function, that's the math symbol for function. So look at the data. If you want to, if the function of the behavior is attention, does the behavior increase when you're providing attention and decrease when you're not? And increase again when you're providing attention and decrease when you're not? So did you actually demonstrate with the data that you've actually identified a functional relation? And then the last one is behavioral. So you want to make sure that the behavior is a target of modification in itself. So you're going to be selecting a behavior, which we call a target behavior. You need to make sure that you operationally define it, which goes back to that technological aspect. And then, target behaviors, sometimes you have a behavioral excess, so you're engaging in a behavior too much. So, you know, maybe hitting for a kid, or you have a behavioral deficit. So you're not engaging in a good behavior, and a behavior that's good. You're not engaging in that behavior enough. So this might be vocalizations or imitation or things like that. So those are our 7 dimensions. You guys remember, get a cab and then go through them. Make sure that you guys can note them and identify them. We are going to be working with these as we go through the course, and they all kind of become intertwined together. So you want to make sure that, yes, you pick an actual behavior to target. That's your behavioral aspect. You want to make sure that it is significant to the person, and that's when you get your applied aspect. You want to make sure that whenever you implement your procedures, that you have described them all really well, and that's the technological aspect. And you want to make sure that you're using procedures such as reinforcement punishment, and you're talking about behavior in that way, which is the conceptually systematic way. And then you want to make sure that when you pick the behavior and you find the function, that you actually do identify the function, and that's your analytic part. And then once you have the function, you'll design your intervention, and you want it to be effective, or you want it to actually change the behavior that you want to change. So change that target behavior and look at the data. If it does, then it's effective. So all these things kind of go into our field and how you should implement treatment and what your treatment should look like and if your treatment is effective or not. All right, so how does ABA actually work? And this is kind of a very simplistic view of it, but I wanted you guys to kind of be able to conceptualize what we actually do as behavior analysts. So first thing, you're going to identify the behavior. This is going to be your target behavior. Like we talked about earlier, it can be a behavioral excess, so something not good, essentially, that you're doing too much of, or it can be a behavioral deficit, so a behavior that is actually good and adaptive that you're not emitting enough. You want to make sure that you define it, and we'll talk about how to define behavior and things like that. All the definitions should be objective and concise and clear. And then you're going to try to determine the function. And we do this in a couple of different ways. You can systematically observe the behavior, and you can look at what's going on in the environment. So what's going on before the behavior occurs and what goes on after the behavior occurs. Or you can systematically manipulate the environment, just like Iwata did in his 1982 article, which we talked about earlier. But regardless, whether you're going to actually manipulate it or observe and kind of hypothesize, you're going to figure out what we call a 3-term contingency, or the ABCs of behavior. So the A is the antecedent, what happens before the behavior, the B is behavior, and then the C is the consequence, so what happens after the behavior occurs. And this whole thing is going to be, this is your 3-term contingency, and the consequence is the function, or why the behavior is occurring. And so you get this functional relationship between the behavior and what's occurring in the environment. So if the behavior occurs, then this consequence happens. Once you determine the function, you're going to rearrange the environment so the person can still get what they want, but they get it for engaging in a behavior that's more appropriate. So basically, the second step, you're going to determine this 3-term contingency, the ABCs of behavior, and then you're going to rearrange the environment so you're kind of being basically a behavioral detective in a way, or not necessarily a behavioral detective, but you're going to arrange this 3-term contingency so it's more appropriate. And then you're going to teach a new behavior. So let's try and practice this. You guys have a case study. So this is Jason. He's an 8-year-old boy with autism, and he's in the 3rd grade. And when the teacher asks him to do schoolwork, which is completing problems in his workbook, he often slams his fist on the desk and rocks back and forth violently in his seat. And when he does this, the teacher usually lets Jason take a break and sit in the chair by himself at the back of the room until he calms down. And this behavior occurs all throughout the day, so it occurs 4 or 5 times every day. So he's basically not getting much of his schoolwork done. So what I want you guys to do is I want you guys to think about, what is this 3-term contingency? So what is the actual problem behavior? And so let me help you guys with the first one. The problem behavior is that he slams his fist on the desk and rocks back and forth violently in his seat. Remember, 3-term contingencies are your ABCs of behavior. So what happens in the environment before the behavior occurs? And that's that what happens is that the teacher asks Jason to do his schoolwork. And then what happens afterwards? The teacher lets him sit in the chair by himself at the back of the room. So that's your contingency. That's your ABC. That's the ABCs. Okay, then I want you guys to tell me what you think the function of the undesirable behavior is. So why is he slamming his fist and rocking back and forth? Why is he doing that? What's the function? What does he get out of it? What's the desirable behavior? What do we want him to do? And what's a good reinforcer for him? What does he want? And then I want you guys to think about how you can rearrange that 3-term contingency to increase the desirable behavior and decrease the undesirable behavior. So I want you guys to just take a couple of minutes, pause this, and try to work these out on your own. Alright, so hopefully you guys did pause it. And so let's go through this. So our ABCs of behavior, or our 3-term contingency, like we talked about earlier, the teacher asks him to do his schoolwork. That's the antecedent. He slams his fist on the desk and rocks back and forth. And the consequence is that he gets to sit in a chair by himself at the back of the room. So the function is escape. So once he slams his desk and walks violently back and forth, he gets to escape, or if you put avoidance of his work, that's fine. He gets to go sit in a chair by himself, so he doesn't have to do his work. The desirable behavior, we want him to complete his workbook problems. And a good reinforcer for him is taking a break and sitting in the chair by himself at the back of the room. I mean, that's what he wants. So how do we systematically rearrange the environment so he gets what he wants, but he gets it for doing the desirable behavior? So the first thing that they did is they asked Jason to complete only really easy workbook problems. And then they developed actually 2 contingencies. So one for the undesirable behavior and one for the desirable behavior. So the teacher asked him to do schoolwork. If he engages in the undesirable behavior, so slamming his fist on the desk and rocking back and forth, then he's not going to be able to escape or go sit in the corner by himself. If he engages in the problem behavior, he has to sit in that chair and do his work. But if the teacher asks him to do his schoolwork and he completes the workbook problems, then he gets to sit in a chair by himself at the back of the room. So basically, think back to the original 3-term contingency. Teacher asks him to do his schoolwork, he slams his fist, he gets to sit in the chair by himself. So basically, he's going to get to sit in the chair by himself. He's going to get his reinforcer that he wants. But he gets it for completing his workbook problems as opposed to slamming his fist on the desk. So we've identified the function. It's escape. We know he wants a break. So we can provide him with a break, but just give him that break when he engages in a behavior that's more appropriate. And just on a side note, typically what they did in this example is they started off, once he completed 2 problems, they let him have a break and sit in the chair by himself. And after he was reliably doing that, they gave him a break after every 3 problems, and then 4 problems, and then 5 problems. So you don't have to just automatically make sure he completes the whole workbook before you give him his break. You can, if he does 1 problem, then give him his break, and then 2 problems, and then 3 problems, and you can kind of work up to it. So that is basically how ABA works. You identify your target behavior, you find the function, you determine an intervention. How are you going to rearrange the environment so that the problem behavior decreases and a new desirable behavior will increase? And that's kind of the basics. Very simplified version, but that's basically what we do. Okay, so last part of the lecture is reviewing just some basic concepts of ABA. And these concepts are essentially foundational principles for our field. So right now, I just want you guys to be able to kind of briefly understand them and identify them. And as we go through the course, we're going to be getting into more depth with them and really talking about them. So first is behavior. Behavior in general is everything that you do that can be observed. So we put the part in there about it that we have to observe it because we have to be able to observe it and measure it. So it needs to be objective, and it needs to be something that actually impacts the physical world. So this is running, jumping, talking, texting, anything like that. Anxiety is not behavior, because anxiety is something that you feel inside and doesn't actually impact the physical world. So anxiety is something that we can't observe, we can't measure. So when we talk about behavior with regards to, behavior analysis, we're talking about something that is objective, that we can measure, something that impacts the physical world. A stimulus, you guys are going to hear me say that a lot, is any object or event that occurs in a person's environment. So, and we have two main stimuli that we talk about within the three-term contingency. So our antecedent is a stimulus that occurs in your environment immediately before the behavior. The behavior, once again, anything a person says or does. And a consequence is the stimulus that occurs in the environment after the behavior occurs. So remember what stimulus is, what antecedent and consequence stimuli are. Now, reinforcement is a consequence of behavior that involves adding or removing something to and from the person's environment, which in turn increases the future strength of that behavior. So, person engages in the behavior, either something good gets added or something aversive gets removed, and then the future probability of the behavior is going to increase. And when we talk about adding or removing something, that's when we refer to positive or negative reinforcement. So the term reinforcement in general is the increase, the future probability of the increase of a behavior. And if it's increasing because after the behavior occurs, something positive gets added, then it's positive reinforcement. If it's improving because something gets removed, then it's negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement, an example, say little Susie shares her toys at school and gets a gold star. Next day, Susie comes in and shares her toys again. The behavior is increasing because she's sharing her toys again. And after she shares her toys, she gets a gold star. Sorry guys, I have my cough. So that would be positive reinforcement. I don't know, you wear a nice outfit and your partner compliments you, so you wear the outfit again. Your behavior is increasing, and after you wear the outfit, you get something added in the environment. You get something added in the environment. Negative reinforcement is something aversive is in effect, and you engage in the behavior. That aversive stimulus gets removed, and therefore your behavior increases. So lots of examples of negative reinforcement. I don't know if you guys wake up in the morning and you hear the alarm go off, and you press the snooze button, and then it goes off again, and you press the snooze button. So your behavior of pressing the snooze button is increasing, so it's reinforcement, but it's increasing because this alarm is this aversive stimulus, and when you press the snooze button, it removes the alarm. Other examples, you have a headache, so you take aspirin, your headache goes away. In the future, when you have a headache again, you're more likely to take aspirin because it removes your headache. So your behavior is increasing because something aversive is being taken away. With both of these, positive and negative, remember that the future probability of the behavior is going to increase. It's just, is it increasing because something gets added after you get engage in the behavior or something gets removed. All right, extinction is when you have a behavior that's been reinforced, so it's increasing, but you no longer provide that reinforcing consequence, and so the behavior will start to decrease. So this is an example of extinction. This is a graph with data of a child screaming before they go to bed. So basically the mom puts them down and I have a little book. The mom puts them down and the child starts screaming. And so in baseline, just before they do anything, the child screams and the parents go in there and pick them up and give them attention. And so once extinction starts right here, the parents are not going to go into the room and provide attention. So they're not going to provide that reinforcing consequence of attention for the screaming. And what we typically see with extinction is before the behavior decreases, you're going to see it increase. And we call that an extinction burst. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to extinction. So we often find with extinction that the behavior gets worse before it actually gets better. Think about a Coke machine. So you guys have had a history of reinforcement with the Coke machine. You put your money in, you get a Coke. Put your money in, get a Coke. It goes on. Well, say one day you go to the Coke machine, you put your money in, and it doesn't give you a Coke. Think about what you do. You typically have what we call that extinction burst. So you're going to push the button a bunch of times. You're going to kick the machine. You're going to shake it. All those things. Then eventually, when it doesn't give you a Coke, you're going to go away. So eventually the behavior will decrease, but we do have that slight increase before it decreases. Stimulus control is also something else that we talk about. And this is when you basically have two stimuli, and in the presence of one stimulus, the behavior gets reinforced, and in the presence of the other one, it does not get reinforced. And therefore, the behavior typically only occurs in the presence of the stimulus in which it was reinforced in. So we have this example right here. We have an antecedent. This is the SD or the S delta, which we'll talk about in a second. And then the R right here is the behavior, and the S plus or the SO is the consequence. So think of the A here, the B, and then the C. So the behavior right here in the middle is the same for each of these, except for the antecedents are different. So when the telephone rings, you pick it up, and there's a friend on the other side. When the doorbell rings, if you pick up the telephone, nobody's going to say hi because nobody's on the phone. So basically you learn to only pick up the phone in the presence of the telephone ringing and not when the doorbell rings. And so we say that picking up the phone and saying hello is under stimulus control of the telephone ringing. So basically when we talk about stimulus control, we're talking about the extent to which something in the environment predicts the behavior occurring. If there's a strong prediction, then you have strong stimulus control. With regards to discriminative stimuli, the antecedent stimulus that has stimulus control over the behavior because the behavior was reinforced in its presence in the past, we call that a discriminative stimulus or an SD. So take the same example. That's where you get the SD from right here. So the telephone rings is a discriminative stimulus in which we know that if we engage the behavior that we're going to get the reinforcer. So with discrimination training, you also have what we call an S delta, and the S delta is a stimulus that does not, the stimulus in which when it happens, our behavior does not get reinforced. So we're essentially going to emit the behavior in the presence of the SD, but not in the presence of the S delta. So the telephone rings, that's SD, we're going to pick it up because we get the reinforcer, whereas the doorbell rings, we're not going to pick up the phone because we don't get reinforced for that behavior. All right, motivating operations is an antecedent. So think about your ABCs of behavior. This is an antecedent. It occurs before the behavior occurs that changes the potency of a consequence as a reinforcer. So this is basically, think about motivation. This is how much does a person want the reinforcer? Do they want the reinforcer, essentially? Um, and we'll talk more about motivating operations as we go through the course, but they have two effects. So they alter the value of the reinforcer, and they also they increase or decrease any behavior that has led to getting that reinforcer in the past. So when we talk about discriminative stimuli, a discriminative stimulus essentially tells us that the reinforcer is available, but a motivating operation is more in terms of, do we even want the stimulus? So it might be available, but do we want it? I always give the example of, we have a street in Katy, and I'm sure you guys, well, they're kind of all over. You drive down the street and you see lots of fast food restaurants, and the fast food sign is on, and so you know that if you go into that restaurant, you're going to get food, so you're going to get the reinforcer. So the sign being on is a discriminative stimulus. It lets you know that food is available, but you might not be hungry. So if you stop or not, whether you stop or not is because, do you want the food or do you not want the food? So the sign could be on, so it could be available, but you might not stop because you might not be hungry. And that would be the motivating operation part of it. Do you want that reinforcer? It might be available, but do you actually want it? All right, prompting is another basic concept. So this is when there's an extra antecedent stimulus that helps a person engage in a particular behavior. And here's our prompting hierarchy. So this is when, so you have your traditional antecedent with your ABC, but this is when you're going to add something extra to the antecedent to help the person engage in the behavior. This is going from the least invasive all the way to the most invasive. So you can use a visual prompt. So say you're trying to tell a little kid, I don't know, to hand you a pencil. You might position the pencil more in front. If you have kind of an array of a pencil, a pen, a crayon, things like that, you might put the pencil a little more in front. That kind of prompts them to pick up that pencil. You can do a verbal prompt, so you can, tell them verbally which stimulus to select. You can gesture, so you can point. You can model, so you can engage in the behavior yourself, or you can physically prompt them. So this would be putting your hand over their hand and picking up the pencil for the child. I do a lot of prompting with my little girl. So she has this toy right here. It's a picnic basket, and basically she takes these little items. So the watermelon, the orange, the sandwich, and the cookie, and she has to put them in these squares right here. And she's really good with the orange, and she's really good with the sandwich, but she has trouble with the little star cookie and the watermelon. So she tries to put the watermelon in the square. And so I usually use a gesture. So I usually point to the watermelon, the triangle, to get her to put the triangle in the correct little spot. So that would be an example of a gestural prompt. All right, generalization. We've kind of talked about this earlier when we had our 7 dimensions. And when we talked about general, that was one of your dimensions. So this is the spreading effects of the intervention to the outside the intervention environment. So you want to make sure that you teach a behavior and it doesn't only occur in the clinic. It can occur in a clinic with the same therapist. It can occur with different therapists, and it can occur in different environments. And you have to program generalization. So you have to provide a lot of examples. You have to change up the person doing the teaching. You'll see if you work in an ABA clinic, you should not always be with the same kid. They should, and typically when I see it done, they work with one therapist in the morning and one therapist in the afternoon, and the therapists kind of rotate every day. You want to make sure that your teaching space is similar to the natural environment. Vary your reinforcers, sit in different seats, teach in different settings or tables, all of those things. it doesn't really do a child any good if you teach them a skill and they can only do it with one person, or they can only do it at the clinic and it doesn't transfer to their natural environment. So you want it to generalize to their natural environment. Alright guys, that's it for this training. I hope you guys got a good overview of ABA. So we talked about the history, we talked about Pavlov and his respondent conditioning, we talked about Watson, SR psychology, we talked about Skinner. He's kind of the father of operant conditioning. We talked about Lovis. He started discrete child training and things like that. We talked about Baer. He was one of the monumental people in the Baer, Wolf, and Risley article, The 7 Dimensions. We talked about Carr. He was the first one that conducted the study that started to form hypotheses about functions, and then really designing the intervention to address the function. And then Iwata, he was the one that really set out a systematic procedure on how to manipulate the environment to figure out the function. We talked about the difference between respondent and operant conditioning. Remember, respondent, we call it respondent because the organism responds to the environment. So there's a stimulus and it elicits a response. And then operant is because the organism operates on the environment and we emit a behavior. We talked about the difference between behavior modification and ABA. Behavior modification is that kind of outdated term. It refers to all procedures used to change behavior, not just ones that use behavior analytic principles. ABA is the updated term, and so I really would, if I were you guys, just kind of get used to using ABA. It really signifies that you're using behavioral principles, that you're looking at the function, and things like that. We talked about the 7 dimensions of behavior. Remember, get a cab. We talked about how ABA works. Remember, you identify the behavior, you identify the function, you rearrange the environment, and you design your intervention based on the function of the behavior. And then you teach any new skills that you need to teach. And then we talked about some basic concepts. So behavior, reinforcement, stimulus, antecedents, consequences, extinction, stimulus control, discriminative stimuli, motivating operations, and prompting. Alright guys, so that's a wrap for us. Our next class is on Monday. We'll be starting Module 2. But for the rest of Module 1, make sure that you guys have read Chapter 1 and complete Module 1. So any other readings, remember your course orientation quiz is due on the 30th, your icebreaker discussion board, your original post is due on the 27th, which is Thursday, and then your reply is due on Sunday, and then your Module 1 quiz is due on Sunday. So alright guys, if you have any questions about the lecture, anything like that, then please email me. You can email me your questions, we can set up a meeting, and also ask if you guys have any questions about it when we start class on Monday. So alright guys, please be safe. I know it's crazy out there with the weather, and so yeah, be safe, take care of yourself, and hopefully I will see you guys in class on Teams on Monday. Alright, bye guys.